Ever felt like your whole life was scripted by others? What if everything you've been told about success, family, and happiness is a lie? Discover the shocking truth behind breaking free from expectations and embracing the life you were truly meant to live. Growing up, my immigrant parents had an almost ritualistic approach to life. Everything I did, from my grades to my behavior, was meticulously recorded in a leather-bound ledger. This wasn't just any notebook, though. This was the record of my existence. Every single action, every single failure, was added to a running tally, as if I was some kind of account that needed to be balanced. And honestly, that's exactly what it felt like. I was constantly under the microscope, every mistake or imperfection accounted for. Their system was simple yet harsh. If I ever scored below 100 inches school, there was a price to pay. And it wasn't just about disappointing them. No, this was a matter of money. A grade lower than perfect meant an additional $1,000 in debt that I had to work off somehow. You might think I'm exaggerating, but the truth is, I could feel the weight of each point I lost. A 99 wasn't just a small disappointment, it was a $1,000 problem. The idea behind it was clear: perfection wasn't just expected, it was demanded. But it wasn't only my grades they kept track of. It was everything: how much time I spent studying, whether I helped around the house, whether I was polite to family members and strangers. It didn't matter what the circumstances were, the ledger kept track. I can still remember being asked, "Why did you spend so much time reading that book?" Or, "Why didn't you help with the dishes last night?" It was like I was constantly being scrutinized, constantly being told that my worth was tied to my actions. There was no room for mistakes, no room for imperfections. And the consequences weren't limited to me alone. My younger sister, who was just trying to live a normal life, often found herself caught in the crossfire. If I did something wrong, she'd suffer too. It wasn't like we had any control over it. The pressure didn't just affect me, it weighed on her as well. Her childhood wasn't hers to enjoy, either. There were countless times she was scolded or even punished for things I did. If I failed, she was the collateral damage. But even with all of this, there was always the promise that if I could just keep pushing, if I could just keep getting the grades, keep achieving, eventually, things would be different. My parents weren't just doing this to punish me, they had big dreams for me. They wanted me to be successful. They wanted me to be a doctor, an engineer, something that would give our family a better life. It wasn't enough to just survive as immigrants in a foreign land. They wanted to ensure that I would thrive. And they believed the only way to do that was through absolute control. That control extended beyond my childhood. When the day finally came and I was accepted into medical school, I thought it was the moment everything would change. I thought that maybe, just maybe, all the sacrifices and all the pressure would finally pay off. But what I didn't expect was the next step in their plan, the one that made me question whether any of it was worth it. My parents had always spoken about the future, about how once I was a successful doctor, I'd be able to repay them for everything they had done for me. But I didn't realize the true extent of this repayment. When I received my acceptance letter, they had me sign something that changed everything. It wasn't a simple agreement or a congratulatory document. It was a contract that gave them 100% of my future income. That's right, 100%. Not a percentage, not a loan to pay off, but a full and total surrender of my future earnings. I remember the day I signed the papers. My hands were shaking. I had worked so hard to get to this point, but now it felt like I was signing away my entire future. It was as if my life had already been mapped out for me, my successes, my failures, my financial stability, all of it would belong to them. At that moment, it felt like I was suffocating. I had reached the pinnacle of what they wanted for me, but in doing so, I realized that I had lost any semblance of control over my own life. Everything I worked for, everything I had sacrificed, seemed to be owned by someone else. But the real shock came when my sister, who had always been under the same pressure, made a decision that changed everything. She didn't just accept the weight of their expectations like I had. No, she chose to escape. She ran away, left everything behind, and disappeared without a trace. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't some dramatic escape scene like you see in the movies. It was more subtle than that. My sister had always been the quiet one, the one who never rocked the boat. But I could see the toll it was taking on her. The constant pressure, The never-ending demands, it wore her down. So, one day, she just left. She took nothing but her clothes and a few personal belongings, and she left. No goodbyes. No explanations. She was gone. It was a shock to everyone. My parents didn't know how to react. They were angry, devastated, and confused. They couldn't understand why she had left, why she had abandoned everything they had worked so hard to give her. They didn't realize that, in trying to control her, they had pushed her to the breaking point. As for me, I was left to pick up the pieces. I had always been the one who followed the rules, who did everything they asked of me. But now, I was left questioning everything. Was this the future I wanted for myself? Was this the life I had worked so hard to build? Or was I just another pawn in their game, another cog in their perfect machine? My sister's escape was the wake-up call I needed. It was the catalyst that made me realize I couldn't keep living this way. Something had to change. But little did I know, this was just the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would force me to face the truth about my family, my future, and myself. After my sister left, the silence in the house was deafening. It was like a vacuum had formed, sucking away all the energy, all the noise, that once filled our home. My parents didn't know what to do. They had lost their grip on one of us, and it left them scrambling to understand why. For the first time, I saw a crack in their armor. My father, who had always been the embodiment of control and authority, seemed like a man lost. He paced around the house, muttering to himself. My mother, too, was visibly shaken. She kept asking me over and over, why would she leave? What did we do wrong? It wasn't just their pride that was hurt, it was the very foundation of their beliefs, the structure they had built for our family, that was beginning to crumble. But I couldn't bring myself to console them. I couldn't pretend like everything was okay. The truth was, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a vast unknown. My sister's escape wasn't just a rebellion, it was a revelation. She had broken free from the invisible chains that had bound all of us, and in doing so, she had shown me a way out. I could no longer ignore the fact that I was living under the same suffocating system. The expectations, the pressure, the sacrifices, it was all too much. And yet, here I was, about to sign away my future, just like my parents had planned all along. I couldn't understand why it had taken me so long to realize this. I had always been the obedient child, the one who followed the rules. But now, looking at the mess we were in, I couldn't help but feel like I was trapped in a life that wasn't truly mine. My parents had made it clear that I was the one who would carry the family name, the one who would make everything right. But at what cost? What was the point of achieving success if I was never allowed to enjoy it? In the days that followed my sister's disappearance, I couldn't focus. I tried to go back to my medical studies, but everything felt hollow. My mind kept wandering to the empty space she had left behind, to the choices she had made. Was she happier now? Was she finally free? I didn't have the answers, but the questions gnawed at me. The strangest part, though, was the guilt. My parents had done so much for me. They had sacrificed everything to give me this opportunity, to give me a future. How could I betray them now? How could I walk away from everything they had planned for me? Everything they had worked so hard for? It felt like the weight of their dreams was on my shoulders, and if I turned my back on them, I would be throwing it all away. But as time passed, I began to see things differently. I started to realize that the life I was living wasn't really mine to begin with. It was a life that had been shaped by their desires, their ambitions, and their expectations. They had set the stage, and I was simply playing the role they had written for me. But I wasn't an actor in their play. I was a person, a human being with my own thoughts, desires, and dreams. I had been so focused on meeting their expectations that I had lost sight of my own. One night, as I was sitting alone in my room, I picked up my phone and started scrolling through social media. It wasn't something I did often, but for some reason, that night, I felt compelled to do so. As I scrolled, I came across a post from a friend of mine who had always been a bit of a rebel. She was living her life on her own terms, traveling the world, doing the things she loved. And as I looked at her photos of her laughing, enjoying life, and living authentically, I felt a wave of jealousy wash over me. I envied her freedom. I envied the fact that she was able to make choices for herself, to live a life that was truly hers. She wasn't bound by anyone's expectations, and that was something I hadn't experienced in a long time. My entire life had been dictated by what my parents wanted, and I was tired of it. I was tired of living in a world where I wasn't allowed to make my own decisions, where everything I did was for someone else's benefit. And that's when I realized I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when I knew deep down that it wasn't. I had spent my whole life trying to meet their expectations, trying to fulfill a role I didn't even choose for myself. But now, I was faced with a choice: stay in this life and continue sacrificing my own happiness, or take control and start living for me. The decision wasn't easy. I knew it wouldn't be. There would be consequences. There always are when you break free from the status quo. But at that moment, I knew that I couldn't continue to live in this suffocating environment, constantly chasing someone else's dream. I had to find my own way. I didn't have a clear plan, and I didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control. I had the power to choose. And that was a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. The next morning, I sat down with my parents. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was time to face the truth. I had to tell them that I wasn't going to sign away my future. I had to tell them that I was going to make my own choices from now on. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the consequences. As I spoke, I could see their shock, their disbelief. They didn't understand at first. They thought I was making a huge mistake. But I knew this was the only way forward. It wasn't about abandoning them or rejecting everything they had done for me. It was about reclaiming my life, my choices, and my happiness. The conversation was long and difficult, but by the end, they understood. They didn't agree, but they understood. And for me, that was enough. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one. It was the first step toward living a life that was truly mine. After I had that conversation with my parents, the house felt even quieter than before. The air was thick with tension. It was as if I had stepped into uncharted territory, and no one really knew how to navigate this new reality. My parents, although understanding, still couldn't fully accept the decision I had made. They were afraid. They didn't know what would happen if I stopped following the path they had paved for me. They didn't know how to deal with the fact that I was finally making decisions for myself. But even though they were scared, there was a strange sense of relief that washed over me. I had finally done something that was completely my own. But as time went on, the weight of my decision began to settle in. I wasn't just rejecting my parents' expectations, I was rejecting the entire life that had been built around me. I was stepping into the unknown, and that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The fear of the unknown was a constant companion, but it was the fear of living a life that wasn't mine that pushed me forward. I had to keep reminding myself that this was the right choice. I had to keep reminding myself that I was doing this for me, not for anyone else. At first, I thought that breaking free from my parents' control would bring instant freedom. I thought that once I made the decision to stop living for them, everything would fall into place. But that's not how it works, is it? Life doesn't just hand you freedom on a silver platter. It's messy. It's complicated. And in many ways, it's even harder than living under the strict expectations of others. I had thought that by rejecting their plan for my future, I would find clarity. But instead, I was left with a sea of uncertainty. What was I supposed to do now? Where was I supposed to go? The first few weeks after I made my decision were filled with confusion. I wasn't in school anymore, not because I had failed, but because I had chosen to step away from it all. I had chosen to walk away from the life that had been mapped out for me. I didn't know what the next step would be. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with my life. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living the way I had been. During this time, I tried to keep myself busy. I started reading more books, not the textbooks or the medical journals that had been part of my life for so long, but books about different philosophies, about self-development, about how to live authentically. I started looking for answers, searching for something that would give me direction. I talked to friends who had taken similar paths, people who had chosen to leave behind the traditional route and forge their own way. And even though their stories were inspiring, they didn't give me the clarity I was looking for. One night, I sat down with a cup of coffee and thought about everything that had led me to this point. I thought about my parents and the sacrifices they had made for me. I thought about the pressure they had placed on me to succeed, the way they had molded me into someone who would eventually repay them for their efforts. But I also thought about my sister, who had chosen to escape. And I thought about the choice I had made to follow her lead and break free. I realized something that night. Breaking free from my parents' expectations wasn't just about rejecting their control. It was about reclaiming my identity. For so long, I had been defined by what they wanted for me. I had been living in a box they had created for me. But now, I had the chance to step out of that box and create my own definition of success. I had the chance to figure out who I truly was, what I truly wanted, and what kind of life I wanted to build for myself. But the fear was still there. What if I failed? What if I couldn't make it on my own? What if I wasn't capable of finding my way without my parents' guidance? These questions plagued my mind, and they made it difficult to take the first step toward my new life. It was so easy to fall back into the old patterns, to slip into the comfort of knowing exactly what was expected of me. But comfort wasn't enough anymore. I had to push through the fear. I had to take a leap, even though I didn't know where I would land. The next few months were a whirlwind of uncertainty. I explored different interests, tried new things, and met new people. I worked odd jobs, not because I needed the money, but because I needed the experience. I needed to prove to myself that I was capable of carving my own path, even if that path was uncertain. I didn't have a clear vision of the future, but I was starting to feel like I was moving in the right direction. But as much as I tried to convince myself that I was doing the right thing, I still felt the weight of my decision. There were times when I would see my friends who were still in school, still following the traditional route, and I would wonder if I had made a huge mistake. Was I throwing away a future that so many people would die for? Was I being selfish by not following the path that my parents had laid out for me? It wasn't until one day, when I was sitting in a small cafe, that I had an epiphany. I had been reading a book on personal growth, and something in the words suddenly clicked. I realized that the greatest form of success wasn't following someone else's dream, it was creating your own. Success wasn't about meeting external expectations. It was about living authentically, living in alignment with your true self. And in that moment, I knew that I had made the right choice. The fear and uncertainty would always be there, but so would the opportunity to build a life that was truly my own. From that day forward, I started to embrace the uncertainty. I stopped worrying about the future and started focusing on the present. I stopped trying to live up to someone else's definition of success, and instead, I began to define success on my own terms. And although the journey was still far from easy, I finally felt like I was on the right path. As time went on, my relationship with my parents began to change. They still didn't fully understand my decision, but they started to see that I wasn't throwing everything away. I was just choosing a different way to live. They began to respect my choices, even if they didn't agree with them. And although the pressure was never completely gone, I started to feel more at peace with my decision. But the real turning point came when I reconnected with my sister. After years of silence, we finally spoke again. She told me about her life, the struggles she had faced, and the freedom she had found. She had made a life for herself, and although it wasn't easy, she was happy. That conversation was the final piece of the puzzle. My sister had shown me that it was possible to live authentically, even if it meant taking risks, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't alone in this journey. I had my sister, I had my friends, and most importantly, I had myself. I had the power to create my own future, and that, more than anything else, was the greatest gift of all. As I moved forward, I realized something crucial. No matter how hard I tried, there would always be people who didn't understand my decision. My parents, though they had come to accept it in their own way, still struggled to see why I had chosen this uncertain path. They couldn't comprehend why I would walk away from the stability they had fought so hard to give me. For them, success was a straight line, a path paved with hard work, education, and a clear sense of direction. But for me, success was about something deeper. It was about finding my purpose, my voice, and living a life that felt authentic to who I was, not who they wanted me to be. But no one ever tells you how hard it is to live authentically. It's not as simple as just making a decision to do things differently. There are the doubters, the naysayers, the people who think you're making a huge mistake. And then, there's the self-doubt that creeps in when you're alone. What if they're right? What if I'm wrong? What if I fail? What if everything I'm doing is just an elaborate mistake? I started to notice these doubts creeping into my mind more and more. In the beginning, I had been full of optimism. I had believed that breaking free would lead me to a life full of opportunities and self-discovery. But the reality was much more difficult. The freedom I had so desperately sought came with its own set of challenges. There were days when I felt lost, unsure of which direction to take. I would look at people who were still on their traditional paths, people with clear goals and careers, and I couldn't help but feel like I was falling behind. I would see them moving forward, and I would feel like I was standing still. But I reminded myself of the reason I had made this decision in the first place. I didn't want to live a life based on someone else's dream. I didn't want to wake up 20 years from now, regretting that I had followed a path that wasn't truly mine. I didn't want to spend my life working toward a future that I had never chosen for myself. That was the moment I had to make a choice. I had to decide if I was going to let fear control me, or if I was going to keep pushing forward, despite the uncertainty. I could either succumb to the pressure of living up to everyone else's expectations, or I could carve my own way, even if it meant walking a lonely road for a while. And so, I decided to keep going. I decided to embrace the uncertainty, to stop worrying about what others thought of me, and to focus on building a life that felt true to who I was. I started by setting small goals for myself. Instead of worrying about the grand vision of my future, I focused on the present moment. What could I do today that would bring me closer to the person I wanted to be? I started to explore different passions, things I had always been interested in but had never given myself the freedom to fully pursue. I took up photography, something I had always loved but never had time for during my years in school. I started traveling to new places, meeting new people, and experiencing life outside the rigid confines of my previous existence. With every new experience, I felt more alive, more connected to myself. I also began to write. I had always enjoyed writing, but I had never seen it as something I could do for a living. Writing was always something I did in my spare time, a hobby, something I did for fun. But as I started to explore my creative side more, I realized that writing could be more than just a hobby. It could be a way to share my story, to express my thoughts and ideas, and to connect with others who were on a similar journey. I started a blog, writing about my experiences, my struggles, and the lessons I was learning along the way. The feedback I received was overwhelming. People from all over the world were reaching out, telling me how much they resonated with my words. That was when I realized I had found something truly special. But as much as I loved writing and exploring my creative side, there was still the reality of life to deal with. I still had bills to pay, responsibilities to meet, and a future to plan for. And the fear of not succeeding in this new life I was creating still loomed over me. It wasn't always easy to push through the doubts, but I knew that if I wanted to make this new life work, I had to keep going. I had to trust myself and my abilities, even when things felt uncertain. I took on freelance work, writing articles, doing photography for small businesses, and slowly building a portfolio. It wasn't glamorous at first, but it was a start. Every small success, every article I wrote, every photo I took made me feel more confident. I was no longer just following a path that was laid out for me. I was creating my own path, one small step at a time. There were moments when I felt completely overwhelmed. I would think about the future and wonder if I was making the right choice. There were times when I missed the security of the old life, the life where everything was mapped out for me, where I knew exactly what to do next. But then I would remind myself of why I made this choice in the first place. I was no longer living for other people's expectations. I was living for myself. One of the hardest parts of this journey was dealing with the guilt. The guilt of walking away from a life that my parents had worked so hard to give me. The guilt of not fulfilling the dream they had for me. It was a constant battle. I knew they wanted the best for me, but I also knew that their idea of what was best wasn't necessarily the same as mine. The guilt was something I had to learn to live with. But I also realized that I couldn't let guilt dictate my life. I couldn't keep living in a way that made me miserable just to avoid feeling guilty. I had to forgive myself and trust that the decision I had made was the right one for me. As I continued on this journey, I began to see that the fear, the doubt, and the guilt were all part of the process. They weren't signs that I had made the wrong choice, they were simply obstacles I had to overcome. And with each obstacle I faced, I grew stronger. I became more confident in my ability to create the life I wanted. I wasn't perfect. There were still times when I felt lost or uncertain, but I was learning to embrace the uncertainty and trust that, in time, everything would fall into place. Through this journey, I learned that living authentically isn't about having everything figured out. It's about taking the first step, even when you don't know where that step will lead. It's about trusting yourself, even when others don't understand. And most importantly, it's about embracing the process, knowing that the road may be long and difficult, but it will always be worth it in the end. As I continued down this winding road of self-discovery and independence, I began to see more clearly the depth of the changes that were happening within me. I had spent so much of my life doing what was expected of me, living within the boundaries of other people's dreams for me, that it felt like I was finally waking up. Waking up to the realization that my life, my choices, and my future were in my hands. But as liberating as this new sense of freedom was, it also brought with it a heavy burden. The weight of the responsibility was sometimes overwhelming. There were no more guidelines, no more structured path laid out for me. I was responsible for every decision I made, for the direction my life was taking. And that was a lot to carry, especially when I had spent so many years relying on others to guide me. I began to question everything in my life, my goals, my values, my beliefs. Everything that had once felt certain now seemed uncertain. Was I making the right choice? Was I heading in the right direction? Was I still on the path to success, or had I veered off into unknown territory? These questions would keep me up at night, sometimes paralyzing me with fear. But despite these fears, I realized something important. Uncertainty was not the enemy. Fear wasn't something to avoid, it was something to embrace. It was a sign that I was stepping outside of my comfort zone, that I was growing. Every time I faced my fear, every time I made a decision without knowing how it would turn out, I was taking control of my own destiny. And that was more important than anything else. One of the most significant shifts in my mindset during this time was the way I started to view failure. Growing up, failure was something to be avoided at all costs. It was something that carried a heavy stigma. Failure meant disappointment, shame, and punishment. It was a reflection of my inadequacy, my inability to live up to expectations. But now, I saw failure in a different light. It wasn't something to be feared or avoided, it was an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to try again. The more I allowed myself to fail, the more I realized that failure was a natural part of life. It wasn't the end of the road, it was simply a detour. Every time I stumbled, I learned something new about myself. Every mistake taught me something valuable. I began to embrace failure as a necessary part of the process, a stepping stone toward success. And that realization was freeing. It took away the pressure to be perfect, to never make a mistake. It allowed me to take risks and trust that even if things didn't work out the way I had planned, I would still be okay. As I continued to experiment with different paths, I found myself drawn more and more to the idea of building something meaningful with my life. I didn't want to just survive, I wanted to thrive. But thriving didn't mean achieving fame or fortune. It didn't mean living up to some arbitrary standard of success. Thriving, for me, meant living a life that was true to my values, that aligned with my passions, and that allowed me to make a positive impact on the world around me. And so, I began to take steps toward building a life that was meaningful. I decided to focus on the things that mattered most to me: my health, my relationships, my passions, and my ability to help others. I started volunteering with local organizations, offering my time and skills to causes I believed in. It wasn't about getting credit or recognition, it was about doing something that felt fulfilling, something that made a difference in the lives of others. Along the way, I also began to reconnect with my sister. After her escape, we had drifted apart. There had been so much tension, so much confusion, that we had stopped communicating. But as time went on, I realized how important it was to rebuild that relationship. My sister had always been my closest ally, the one person who understood the pressure we were both under. And even though she had chosen to leave and carve her own path, I knew we still shared a bond, a connection that couldn't be broken. When we finally reconnected, it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. We talked for hours, sharing our experiences, our struggles, and our triumphs. I learned so much from her about resilience, about the strength it took to walk away from everything and start over. She had found her own way in the world, and in many ways, She had become the person I aspired to be, someone who wasn't afraid to live authentically, someone who had the courage to create her own life. As I listened to her talk about her journey, I realized how much I had grown. I had come a long way since I had first made the decision to break free from my parents' expectations. I had faced my fears, embraced failure, and discovered what it meant to live authentically. And I realized that I wasn't just doing this for myself, I was doing it for my family too. I was showing them that it was possible to live a different kind of life, a life that was built on my own terms. But even as I felt a sense of accomplishment, I knew that the journey was far from over. The road ahead was still full of uncertainty, full of challenges. There would be times when I would doubt myself, when I would wonder if I had made the right choice. But I knew now that I had the strength to keep going, that I had the courage to face whatever came my way. In the end, I realized that breaking free from my parents' expectations wasn't just about rejecting their control, it was about creating a new narrative for myself. It was about rewriting the story of my life, taking ownership of my choices, and building a future that felt true to who I was. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without its struggles. But it was mine. And as I stood on the edge of this new chapter, I felt a sense of peace. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living for anyone else's approval. I wasn't chasing someone else's dream. I was living for me. And that, in itself, was the greatest accomplishment of all. The months passed, and with each passing day, I felt more and more like I was becoming the person I had always wanted to be. There were moments when I still questioned my decisions, moments when I felt like I wasn't doing enough or wasn't moving fast enough. But as I continued on this journey, I began to notice that my life was slowly, but surely, falling into place. I had started to build a career for myself, one that was based on my passions, my interests, and my values. I wasn't following a traditional path, but that didn't matter anymore. The work I was doing felt meaningful. I wasn't just clocking in to get a paycheck. I was doing something that felt authentic, something that brought me joy. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was truly living. But as much as I had grown in my career, I realized that there were still areas of my life that needed attention. Relationships, for example. I had always put so much focus on my education, my career, and my future that I had neglected the people who mattered most to me. My parents, my sister, my friends, they had all been pushed to the background, while I was busy trying to build a life that was perfect. I knew that I needed to make amends with my parents. Our relationship had been strained for so long, and even though they had come to accept my decision, there was still an underlying tension between us. I had distanced myself from them emotionally, thinking that breaking free meant cutting ties with the past. But what I had failed to realize was that true freedom wasn't about severing connections. It was about learning to redefine those connections in a healthier, more authentic way. It was time for me to have an honest conversation with my parents, to clear the air and rebuild our relationship. I knew it wouldn't be easy. There was still so much resentment, so many unspoken feelings that had built up over the years. But I also knew that if I wanted to fully embrace my new life, I had to make peace with my past. So, one evening, I sat down with my parents. It was awkward at first. We had never been the type of family to have deep, emotional conversations. But as I spoke, I realized just how much I had missed them. They weren't perfect, and neither was I. But we were family. And in that moment, I understood that family didn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. We talked about everything, about the pressures I had felt growing up, about the mistakes I had made, about the distance that had grown between us. I explained why I had made the decision to break away, why I had chosen to live my life on my own terms. And to my surprise, my parents listened. They didn't agree with everything I said, but they heard me. And that was enough. It wasn't an instant fix, of course. Rebuilding a relationship takes time, and there were still moments of tension, moments when old wounds would resurface. But what mattered was that we were making progress. We were learning to communicate, to understand each other in ways we never had before. And slowly, but surely, the walls that had been built up between us started to come down. During this time, I also reconnected with my sister. After her escape, we had drifted apart. She had started a new life for herself, and I had been so focused on my own journey that I had lost touch with her. But now, as I was finding my own sense of peace, I realized how important it was to have her back in my life. We started talking again, sharing our stories, our experiences, and our hopes for the future. It felt like no time had passed. We were still the same people, just a little older, a little wiser. And as we talked, I realized how much we had both grown. My sister had found her own way, and I had found mine. And even though our paths had been different, we had both made choices that led us to a place of fulfillment. Through our conversations, I began to understand her journey better. She had struggled just like I had, trying to find her own voice in a world that wanted to control her. But she had made the choice to escape, to take control of her own life. And in many ways, I realized that she had been the one to lead the way. Her courage to break free had inspired me to do the same. As we reconnected, I also realized that I had to reconnect with myself. I had spent so much of my life trying to meet other people's expectations, trying to be someone I wasn't, that I had lost sight of who I truly was. I had to rediscover my own passions, my own desires, and my own purpose. I had to stop living for others and start living for myself. And so, I began to invest in my own growth. I took time to reflect on the things that truly mattered to me, the things that brought me joy and fulfillment. I started to write more, to express myself in ways I never had before. I began to take better care of my health, both physically and mentally. I started to set goals that were based on my own values, not on what others expected of me. Through this process, I learned something important. Life isn't about achieving some external version of success. It's about finding peace with yourself, embracing who you are, and living a life that feels authentic. The pressure to succeed, to meet society's expectations, had weighed me down for so long. But once I let go of that pressure, once I stopped trying to live up to someone else's idea of success, I found freedom, true freedom. And as I moved forward, I began to see the impact of my decisions. I wasn't just changing my own life, I was also inspiring others. People who had been stuck in the same rut I had once been in started reaching out, asking for advice, asking how I had found the courage to break free. And for the first time, I realized that my story mattered. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about helping others find their own way, helping them break free from the expectations that held them back. It wasn't always easy, of course. There were still moments of doubt, moments when I questioned whether I was on the right path. But as I looked back on everything I had accomplished, everything I had learned, I knew that I had made the right choice. I had chosen to live my life on my own terms, and that was the greatest gift I could give myself. I had finally come full circle. I had broken free from the chains that had once held me down. I had learned to embrace my authenticity, to live for myself and not for others. And as I stood at the edge of this new chapter, I felt a sense of peace. Because for the first time in my life, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be. As I continued down this path of self-discovery and growth, I began to realize that the journey I had embarked upon wasn't just about finding freedom for myself, it was about learning to redefine what it meant to live a meaningful life. I had spent so many years chasing after external goals, trying to meet other people's expectations, that I had forgotten to ask myself what I truly wanted. Now, with the freedom I had fought so hard to gain, I was finally able to explore what it meant to live life on my own terms. But living authentically, as I had learned, wasn't just about following your passions or making big, bold moves. It was also about the small, everyday choices, the decisions that seemed insignificant, but ultimately shaped who you were and how you experienced the world. It was about showing up for yourself every day, no matter how difficult or uncertain the journey might be. It was about being kind to yourself, forgiving yourself when you stumbled, and always remembering that you were worthy of the life you were creating. One of the first things I had to confront as I moved forward was the concept of success. Growing up, success had been defined by external markers, academic achievements, career milestones, and financial security. My parents had set these standards, and for a long time, I had accepted them without question. But now, as I was living life on my own terms, I realized that success wasn't something to be measured by someone else's standards. Success wasn't about achieving more, earning more, or proving anything to anyone. It was about finding joy in the journey, embracing the challenges, and living a life that felt true to who you were. I had to let go of the idea that success was a destination. Instead, I began to see it as a process. It was about growth, learning, and evolving along the way. It was about being able to look back and feel proud of the person you were becoming, not just the achievements you had accumulated. Success wasn't about what you had, but about who you were becoming. One of the most powerful lessons I learned during this time was that the only person I needed to impress was myself. For so long, I had been focused on meeting other people's expectations, my parents, my friends, societies. But once I let go of that pressure, I was free to explore what truly mattered to me. I began to set goals that were aligned with my values, goals that were about personal growth rather than external validation. I realized that true success came from within, from the sense of fulfillment that came when I was living a life that felt authentic and meaningful. As I embraced this new mindset, I began to see the ripple effect it had on every area of my life. My relationships with others began to change, as well. I had spent so much time trying to please everyone, trying to fit into the molds that had been created for me. But as I began to embrace my authenticity, I found that the relationships that truly mattered were the ones where I could show up as my true self without fear, without pretending to be someone I wasn't. I started to surround myself with people who supported my journey, people who understood the importance of living authentically and who encouraged me to continue growing. These relationships weren't perfect, they were messy, just like life. But they were real. They were based on mutual respect, understanding, and a shared commitment to living a life that felt true to who we were. At the same time, I also began to let go of relationships that were no longer serving me. It wasn't easy, and there was guilt at first. I had spent so many years holding on to people and situations out of a sense of obligation, because I thought I had to. But as I started to prioritize my own well-being, I realized that it was okay to let go of things that no longer brought me peace. Letting go wasn't about abandoning people, it was about creating space for the relationships that truly nourished me, the ones that helped me grow and supported me in my journey. But the most difficult relationship I had to rebuild was the one with myself. For so long, I had been my harshest critic, constantly doubting myself, second-guessing my decisions, and never feeling like I was enough. But as I learned to live more authentically, I began to see the importance of self-compassion. I had to stop punishing myself for my mistakes and start seeing them as opportunities for growth. I had to learn to forgive myself, to let go of the shame and guilt that had held me back for so long. Learning to love myself, truly and deeply, was one of the hardest things I had ever done. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It took time, patience, and a willingness to embrace all parts of who I was, even the parts I wasn't proud of. But as I started to accept my imperfections and all, I began to see myself in a new light. I wasn't perfect, but I was worthy. I wasn't defined by my mistakes or my past, but by my ability to learn, to grow, and to keep moving forward. This process of self-acceptance also helped me redefine my relationship with fear. Fear had always been a constant companion, especially during the early days of breaking free from my parents' expectations. It had held me back, kept me from taking risks, and convinced me that I wasn't capable of achieving anything on my own. But as I embraced my authenticity and began to live my truth, I realized that fear was no longer something to be avoided. It was something to be acknowledged, understood, and moved through. Fear became a sign that I was stepping into new territory, that I was growing. It wasn't a roadblock, it was a reminder that I was on the right path. The more I faced my fears, the more I realized that I was stronger than I had ever known. And the more I leaned into the discomfort of fear, the more I discovered just how much I was capable of. As I continued on this journey, I found that my life was becoming richer, fuller, and more meaningful than I had ever imagined. I wasn't living for anyone else anymore. I was living for me. And that, in itself, was the greatest gift I could give myself. But I also began to see the importance of sharing this gift with others. As I grew in my authenticity and began to embrace my true self, I realized that I had a responsibility to help others do the same. I wanted to share my story, to show others that it was possible to break free from the constraints of society, family, and expectations, and to live a life that was true to who they were. And so, I began to speak up. I started writing, speaking at events, and sharing my journey with anyone who would listen. I wanted to inspire others to take that first step, to make the decision to live authentically, no matter how difficult or scary it might be. Because I knew, deep down, that living authentically was the key to true happiness, true fulfillment, and true success. As I ventured deeper into my journey, I began to realize that the path to authenticity wasn't always linear. It wasn't a clear, well-marked trail that I could simply follow. There were bumps in the road, detours, and unexpected obstacles. But each challenge I faced only reinforced the truth I had discovered. Living authentically wasn't about having everything figured out. It was about embracing the uncertainty and continuing to move forward, even when I couldn't see the full picture. I began to notice something else as well. The more I lived authentically, the more I attracted others who were on the same path. My circle of friends began to change. I started spending time with people who encouraged me to keep growing, to keep pushing myself, and to keep striving to live a life that felt true to my values. They weren't perfect, and neither was I, but there was a shared understanding that we were all in this together. We were all learning, evolving, and supporting each other along the way. These new relationships were different from the ones I had cultivated in the past. In the past, I had been surrounded by people who expected me to fit into certain molds, who wanted me to conform to a specific way of life. But now, the people I surrounded myself with didn't have those expectations. They celebrated my uniqueness, my quirks, and my journey. They weren't trying to change me, they were supporting me in becoming the best version of myself. But this shift in my relationships wasn't without its challenges. It wasn't always easy to let go of the old friendships, the ones that no longer served me, the ones that were based on superficial connections or unspoken expectations. Saying goodbye to those relationships was difficult. It felt like I was letting go of pieces of my past, of people who had been a part of my life for so long. But in doing so, I was making space for the relationships that truly mattered, the ones that would help me grow, heal, and become the person I was meant to be. And while it wasn't always comfortable, I began to realize that letting go of certain relationships wasn't a betrayal, it was an act of self-love. By choosing to surround myself with people who supported my journey, I was choosing to honor my own path, my own needs, and my own growth. It wasn't about abandoning anyone, it was about prioritizing my own well-being, my own happiness, and my own evolution. This shift in my relationships also extended to my family. I had spent so many years feeling guilty for not meeting their expectations, for not fulfilling the dreams they had for me. But as I learned to live authentically, I began to realize that I couldn't keep living for others. I had to live for myself. And that meant setting boundaries, even with the people I loved most. The process of setting boundaries wasn't easy. It meant having difficult conversations with my parents, explaining to them that while I appreciated everything they had done for me, I needed to make my own choices. It meant standing firm in my decision to live my life on my own terms, even when it meant disappointing them. But I knew that I couldn't keep living in a way that didn't align with my true self. At first, my parents didn't understand. They were hurt, confused, and frustrated. They couldn't fathom why I would choose to walk away from the life they had worked so hard to create for me. But over time, they began to see that this wasn't about rejecting them, it was about finding my own way. And as they started to see the changes in me, the growth, the sense of fulfillment, they began to accept that I was living my truth. I also had to learn to forgive myself. For so long, I had been so hard on myself, so critical of every decision I made. I had held on to guilt and shame for not meeting other people's expectations, for not living up to the standards that had been set for me. But as I learned to live authentically, I realized that I couldn't keep carrying that burden. I had to forgive myself for the mistakes I had made, for the choices I had made in the past that didn't align with my true self. And in doing so, I was able to let go of the shame that had been holding me back. Learning to forgive myself was a process. It didn't happen overnight. There were times when I would slip back into old patterns of self-criticism and doubt. But as I continued to move forward, I became more compassionate toward myself. I began to see that I was human, that I was allowed to make mistakes, and that I was worthy of love and acceptance just as I was. This process of self-forgiveness also taught me to be more patient with myself. I had spent so much time trying to be perfect, trying to meet everyone's expectations, that I had forgotten to be kind to myself. I had forgotten that growth takes time, that healing is a journey, and that it's okay to not have everything figured out. As I continued to embrace my authenticity, I began to feel more at peace with the person I was becoming. I stopped trying to live up to an idealized version of success, and instead focused on creating a life that felt true to me. I began to realize that success wasn't about external validation, it was about inner peace, self-acceptance, and living a life that aligned with my values. One of the most empowering aspects of this journey was learning to trust myself. For so long, I had relied on others to tell me what was right, to guide me along the way. But as I began to trust myself more, I realized that I had the wisdom within me to make decisions that were in alignment with my truth. I no longer needed to seek approval from others. I could trust my own instincts, my own desires, and my own path. It wasn't always easy, but the more I trusted myself, the more I realized that I was capable of navigating this journey on my own. I didn't need anyone else's approval to feel worthy or successful. I didn't need to live up to anyone else's expectations. I was enough, just as I was. As I continued down this path of self-discovery, I also began to embrace the beauty of imperfection. I had spent so much of my life trying to be perfect, trying to meet other people's standards, that I had forgotten to appreciate the messy, imperfect beauty of life. The struggles, the failures, the moments of doubt, they were all part of the process. They were what made me human. They were what made me real. And as I embraced this imperfection, I began to see the beauty in others as well. I stopped looking for flaws, stopped trying to make people fit into certain boxes. Instead, I began to see people for who they truly were: complex, messy, beautiful beings, just like me. And in doing so, I found a deeper sense of connection with the world around me. This sense of connection extended to my work as well. As I began to live authentically, I realized that my work wasn't just about earning a paycheck, it was about contributing to something greater than myself. It was about sharing my story, my experiences, and my lessons with others. It was about helping others find their own authenticity, their own truth. And in that, I found my purpose. My purpose wasn't to achieve success in the traditional sense, it was to help others live their truth, to inspire them to break free from the expectations that had been placed upon them, and to live a life that was truly their own. As the journey progressed, I began to realize that living authentically wasn't just about making individual decisions or breaking free from the constraints of my past. It was about the deeper, more fundamental changes I had to make within myself. It wasn't just about the actions I was taking or the goals I was pursuing. It was about the way I was thinking, the way I was seeing myself, and the way I was perceiving the world. The deeper I went into this process of self-discovery, the more I started to realize how much of my life had been influenced by the beliefs and assumptions I had about myself, others, and the world around me. Growing up, I had been taught to believe that success was measured by external accomplishments, by grades, by titles, by financial security. But now, I was beginning to see that success wasn't about what you had or what you achieved. It was about how you felt about who you were. It became clear to me that the beliefs I had carried with me for so long were not my own. They had been instilled in me by others, by my parents, by society, by the people around me. These beliefs had shaped the way I viewed myself and the world, but they weren't necessarily true. They were simply the result of conditioning, the influence of those who had shaped my life up to that point. One of the first steps in this process was letting go of the need to prove myself to others. For so much of my life, I had been focused on meeting other people's expectations, trying to gain their approval, trying to fit into the molds they had set for me. But as I embraced my authenticity, I began to see that I didn't need anyone's approval to be worthy. I was worthy, simply because I existed. And the more I internalized this truth, the more I began to feel a sense of peace with myself. I started to understand that true worth isn't found in external validation, it's found within. It's about recognizing your own value, regardless of what others think or say. It's about being proud of who you are and the choices you make. And it's about being willing to stand firm in your truth, even when it's difficult. This realization was both liberating and challenging. On the one hand, it felt incredibly freeing to let go of the constant need for approval. But on the other hand, it was difficult to confront the parts of myself that had been conditioned to seek validation. I had spent so much time trying to please others that I didn't know how to please myself. I had spent so much time trying to meet external expectations that I had forgotten what my own expectations were. But as I worked through this process, I began to rediscover my own desires. I started to listen to my own voice, to hear what I truly wanted, independent of anyone else's influence. I began to make decisions based on what felt right for me, not based on what others thought I should do. And in doing so, I started to feel a sense of empowerment that I had never experienced before. At the same time, I began to see how much power we all have to shape our own lives. We often think that we're at the mercy of the world around us, that we're bound by our circumstances, by our past, or by the expectations of others. But the more I embraced my authenticity, the more I realized that we have the power to choose, to create our own reality, and to change the course of our lives at any time. This realization was a game changer. It shifted the way I saw myself and the way I saw the world. Instead of feeling like a passive participant in my own life, I began to see myself as the active creator of my reality. I was no longer at the mercy of anyone else's expectations. I was the one making the decisions, taking the actions, and shaping my future. But even with this newfound sense of empowerment, I also learned that there is beauty in letting go. Letting go of control, letting go of the need to have everything figured out, letting go of the fear of failure. It wasn't about forcing things to happen, about controlling every aspect of my life. It was about trusting the process, trusting that everything was unfolding as it should, and knowing that I didn't have to have all the answers right away. This shift in perspective allowed me to embrace uncertainty in a new way. Instead of seeing uncertainty as something to fear, I began to see it as an opportunity for growth. I realized that uncertainty is where the magic happens. It's where the unexpected gifts and opportunities arise. It's where we discover new possibilities, new perspectives, and new aspects of ourselves. This mindset also helped me move through the inevitable setbacks and failures that came along the way. I had to learn to embrace failure as part of the process, not as something to be avoided or feared. Every failure was a lesson, every setback was an opportunity to learn, to adapt, and to grow stronger. But despite these realizations, there were still moments when doubt crept in. There were still moments when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing, whether I was on the right path. And in those moments, I had to remind myself of everything I had learned, that I didn't need to have it all figured out, that I didn't need to know exactly what the future held, and that the journey itself was just as important as the destination. The truth was, I had been so focused on achieving success in the traditional sense for so long that I had forgotten to enjoy the process. I had forgotten to appreciate the small moments, the quiet victories, the growth that was happening every day. But as I embraced my authenticity, I started to see that the process was the destination. The journey itself, with all its ups and downs, was what truly mattered. I also began to see that success wasn't just about achieving personal goals, it was about contributing to the world in a meaningful way. It was about using my gifts, my talents, and my experiences to help others, to make a difference, and to create a positive impact. It wasn't about climbing the ladder of success for the sake of personal gain. It was about using whatever success I achieved to create a ripple effect, to inspire others to live authentically, and to help them find their own path. This sense of purpose began to shape everything I did. It wasn't just about building a career or achieving personal milestones. It was about creating a life that had meaning, that had a purpose beyond just my own success. It was about contributing to something greater than myself and using my journey to inspire others to do the same. As I moved forward, I began to see the power of community. I wasn't alone in this journey. There were others out there who were on the same path, who were seeking authenticity, who were breaking free from the constraints of society, family, and expectations. And together, we were creating a movement of people who were committed to living their truth and helping others do the same. This community became a source of strength and inspiration. We supported each other, encouraged each other, and shared our stories. We were no longer isolated in our struggles, no longer trying to figure it out alone. We were in this together, and that sense of connection made all the difference. As I continued to walk this path of living authentically, I began to realize that there was something deeply transformative happening, not just within me, but in the way I saw the world. The more I embraced my true self, the more I began to see the beauty in everything around me. I had spent so much of my life focusing on what I thought I should be, on the achievements I needed to accomplish, that I had overlooked the simple joys of life, the things that made it worth living. Now, I was learning to appreciate those small moments, the quiet mornings with a cup of coffee, the laughter of friends, the warmth of a hug, the feeling of accomplishment after completing something meaningful. These moments, I realized, were the true treasures of life. But even with this newfound appreciation for the small things, I was still confronted with the inevitable challenges that came with breaking free from societal expectations. There were times when I felt isolated, as if I was walking a path that no one else understood. At times, I felt the weight of my decisions more heavily than I had in the past, as if the responsibility of creating my own life and choosing my own way was too much to bear. But it was during these moments of uncertainty that I learned the most about myself. I realized that the journey to authenticity wasn't always going to be easy. It wasn't going to be a smooth, well-paved road. It would have bumps, twists, and turns, but that was all part of the process. Through the ups and downs, I began to cultivate a sense of inner peace that I had never experienced before. I realized that true peace comes from within, not from external circumstances, not from the approval of others, but from the way you feel about yourself. The more I embraced my true self, the more I learned to trust my own instincts, to rely on my own inner guidance. I didn't need to ask for permission to live my life. I didn't need to constantly seek validation. I was enough, just as I was. This sense of inner peace was liberating. It freed me from the constant cycle of self-doubt and comparison that had plagued me for so long. No longer did I need to measure my worth against anyone else's standards. I began to trust that I was exactly where I needed to be, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain. I realized that every experience, every challenge, every setback was simply a stepping stone in my journey. And rather than resisting these challenges, I learned to embrace them. They were not obstacles to my happiness. They were opportunities for growth, opportunities for me to become stronger, more resilient, and more confident in my ability to navigate life on my own terms. As I embraced this new mindset, I began to see the world through a different lens. I stopped viewing everything as a competition, stopped measuring my success against others. I realized that everyone was on their own journey, and there was no right way to live. What mattered was that we were all doing our best, and that we were all deserving of love, respect, and fulfillment, regardless of where we were in life. This shift in perspective allowed me to release the pressure I had placed on myself for so many years. I no longer felt the need to be perfect, to have everything figured out. Instead, I began to focus on the present moment, on enjoying the journey, rather than fixating on the destination. I also realized that I couldn't do it all alone. While I had spent so much time trying to figure things out on my own, I now understood the importance of community. The support of others, the encouragement of like-minded individuals, was crucial to my growth. I began to surround myself with people who lifted me up, who understood my journey, and who helped me stay grounded when things felt overwhelming. These relationships were different from the ones I had in the past. They weren't based on superficial connections or expectations. They were based on mutual respect, understanding, and a shared commitment to living authentically. But building these kinds of relationships wasn't always easy. I had to let go of some old friendships, the ones that no longer served me, the ones that kept me stuck in old patterns. This process was painful, but it was necessary. I had spent so much time trying to please others, trying to fit into molds that weren't mine, that I had neglected the relationships that truly mattered. As I began to prioritize my own well-being and authenticity, I also began to see the importance of surrounding myself with people who were aligned with my values. Letting go of those old relationships wasn't a betrayal, it was an act of self-love. It was about choosing to prioritize my own growth, my own happiness, and my own well-being. And as I did, I began to create space for new, more meaningful connections, relationships that supported me, that encouraged me to grow, and that inspired me to live my truth. This new sense of community also extended to my family. Although there were still moments of tension and misunderstanding, I began to rebuild my relationship with my parents. I had spent so much time resenting their expectations and feeling trapped by their dreams for me that I had forgotten how much they loved me. I began to see that they had always wanted the best for me, they just didn't know how to support me in the way that I needed. Through honest conversations, through vulnerability and understanding, I was able to reconnect with them in a way that felt authentic. We weren't perfect, but we were learning to accept each other for who we truly were, rather than who we thought we should be. Through this process, I also began to see the importance of forgiveness. Forgiving myself for all the times I had been too hard on myself, too critical, too focused on meeting other people's expectations. And forgiving others for the ways in which they had unknowingly placed their own expectations on me. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing the hurt or the mistakes, it was about freeing myself from the burden of resentment so that I could move forward with peace in my heart. As I continued to embrace my authenticity, I realized that the most important relationship I had was the one I had with myself. I had spent so many years looking outside of myself for validation, for answers, for approval. But now, I was learning to trust myself, to believe in my own worth, and to honor my own journey. This wasn't a destination, it was a process, a lifelong journey of growth, discovery, and self-love. In many ways, this journey had only just begun. There was still so much more to learn, so much more to discover about myself and the world around me. But what I had learned so far had been transformative. I had discovered the power of living authentically, of embracing my true self, of trusting my own instincts and intuition. I had learned that success wasn't about external validation, it was about living a life that felt true to who I was, a life that was meaningful, fulfilling, and aligned with my values. And as I looked ahead to the future, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, I was ready. Because I had already begun to build the foundation for a life that was truly mine, a life that was grounded in authenticity, self-love, and a deep sense of peace. And that, I realized, was the greatest success of all. As I continued to grow, I found myself facing the inevitable question that had lingered in the back of my mind for so long: what now? I had spent so much of my life focused on breaking free from the expectations of others, on finding my own path, and on learning to live authentically. But now that I had arrived at a place where I felt at peace with myself, where I no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone, I couldn't help but wonder what the next step was. What was I supposed to do with all this newfound freedom? The answer, I soon realized, wasn't about figuring out a specific plan or a rigid set of goals. It wasn't about reaching some predetermined destination or achieving a set of external markers of success. The answer was simpler, yet more profound. It was about continuing to show up for myself, every day, in whatever way felt true in the moment. It was about honoring the journey, rather than focusing on a specific outcome. This realization was liberating, yet humbling. I had spent so much of my life chasing after something external, whether it was the approval of my parents, the validation of my peers, or the achievement of some societal standard of success. But now, I understood that the most important thing wasn't reaching a destination. It was the act of showing up, of being present with myself and with life, of embracing the journey with all its twists and turns, its highs and lows. With this new mindset, I began to approach each day with a sense of curiosity and openness. Instead of feeling pressured to achieve something, I started to look at life as an opportunity to explore, to learn, and to grow. I no longer saw setbacks as failures, but as lessons. I no longer saw challenges as obstacles, but as invitations to become stronger, more resilient, and more connected to my true self. One of the first areas where I felt this shift was in my work. For so long, I had viewed my career as a means to an end, a way to prove myself, to show that I was capable, to earn the approval of others. But now, I began to see my work differently. It wasn't just about achieving success or climbing a ladder. It was about using my talents and my passion to contribute to something greater than myself. It was about creating something that had meaning, something that could make a positive impact on the world and on others. This shift in perspective made a world of difference. I stopped chasing external markers of success, and instead, I focused on creating work that was authentic to me. I allowed myself to take risks, to experiment, and to make mistakes. I learned that the process of creating was just as important, if not more important, than the end result. I began to see that success wasn't just about what I produced, but about how I showed up in the world, how I approached my work, and how I used my talents to connect with others. I also realized that part of living authentically was about giving back. It wasn't enough to just focus on my own growth and happiness. I had a responsibility to contribute to the well-being of others, to help those who were struggling with the same challenges I had faced. I had learned so much about myself through this process of self-discovery, and I knew that I couldn't keep that knowledge to myself. I had to share it, to help others find their own path to authenticity. And so, I began to mentor others. I started sharing my story, offering guidance, and supporting those who were looking to break free from the same limitations I had faced. It wasn't about telling them what to do or giving them a set of rules to follow. It was about helping them find their own way, supporting them as they navigated their own journey of self-discovery, and encouraging them to trust themselves, just as I had learned to trust myself. It was through this process of mentoring and helping others that I truly began to see the impact of living authentically. When I saw others embrace their true selves, when I saw them break free from the constraints of societal expectations and begin to live life on their own terms, it filled me with a deep sense of fulfillment. I realized that the journey I had taken wasn't just about me, it was about creating a ripple effect, about inspiring others to take the leap and live authentically too. This sense of purpose, of contributing to something greater than myself, gave my life even more meaning. It made me realize that living authentically wasn't just about personal freedom, it was about creating a more authentic world. One where people could embrace their true selves without fear of judgment or rejection. It was about helping others find their voice, their purpose, and their truth. But even with this newfound sense of purpose, I still faced challenges. There were moments of doubt, moments when I questioned whether I was on the right path, moments when I felt lost or uncertain. But these moments were no longer paralyzing. I had learned to accept them as part of the process, as part of the journey. I had learned to trust that everything was unfolding as it should, and that no matter what happened, I would be okay. I also realized that it wasn't enough to just help others find their authenticity. I had to continue to do the same for myself. Living authentically wasn't a one-time decision or a final destination, it was an ongoing process, one that required continuous self-reflection, growth, and adaptation. I had to keep checking in with myself, asking myself if I was still on the right path, if I was still living in alignment with my true self. And so, I made a commitment to myself to continue showing up for myself, every day, in every area of my life. I committed to staying true to my values, to my passions, and to my purpose. I committed to continuing to grow, to learn, and to evolve. I committed to living authentically, no matter what. In doing so, I found a deep sense of peace. I no longer felt like I was chasing after something. I was no longer trying to prove myself, to earn the approval of others. I was simply living, fully and authentically, in each moment. And that, I realized, was enough. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I was no longer afraid. I had learned to trust the process, to trust myself, and to trust that whatever happened, I was exactly where I was meant to be. I had learned that true fulfillment didn't come from external achievements or validation, it came from within, from living in alignment with my truth, and from embracing every part of the journey, no matter where it led. As I moved deeper into this new way of living, something within me began to shift. I had spent so much of my life caught in the hustle, constantly striving, constantly reaching for the next goal, the next milestone, the next step. But now, with all the lessons I had learned and all the growth I had experienced, I began to realize something profound. Life isn't about the destination, it's about the journey. This wasn't an easy realization. For years, I had been conditioned to believe that success meant achieving certain things, graduating from the best school, landing the perfect job, earning a specific amount of money. But now, I began to see that these were simply external markers, and while they could bring temporary satisfaction, they didn't bring lasting fulfillment. True fulfillment came from living a life that aligned with your values, from making choices that felt authentic and true to who you were, rather than what others expected you to be. This new perspective was freeing, yet it also came with its own set of challenges. I had to let go of so many preconceived notions about success, about what it meant to be good enough, about how I should be living. I had to release the pressure I had placed on myself to constantly achieve, to always be moving forward at a rapid pace. Instead, I began to embrace the idea that life was about flow, about finding balance, and about savoring the present moment. Living authentically didn't mean that I would never face challenges or obstacles. In fact, I knew that life would always have its ups and downs. But what I had learned was that these challenges didn't have to define me. They were simply part of the process. What mattered was how I responded to them, how I showed up for myself in the face of adversity. The more I reflected on this, the more I realized that I had been living in reaction to life for so long, I had been reacting to the expectations of my family, to the pressures of society, to the judgments of others. I had been so focused on doing what I thought I was supposed to do, that I had forgotten how to simply be. Being present in my own life, not constantly chasing after something, was a skill I had to relearn. But as I practiced it, I found a deep sense of peace that had been missing for so long. The peace I found didn't come from external circumstances. It didn't come from having everything figured out or from achieving a specific goal. It came from within, from embracing myself, my journey, and the unfolding process of life. I began to understand that peace isn't something you find outside of yourself. It's something you cultivate within, by choosing to let go of the need to control everything, by accepting yourself as you are, and by choosing to live in alignment with your true essence. One of the most powerful lessons I learned during this period of self-reflection was the importance of gratitude. Gratitude wasn't just a fleeting feeling of thankfulness for the good things in my life, it was a way of being. It was about acknowledging the blessings in my life, no matter how small, and appreciating the experiences that had shaped me into who I was. Gratitude had the power to shift my mindset from one of scarcity to one of abundance. When I focused on what I had, rather than what I lacked, I began to see the richness of my life. This mindset shift wasn't always easy. It was easy to fall back into old patterns of thinking, to compare myself to others or to focus on what I hadn't achieved. But every time I found myself slipping into these old ways of thinking, I reminded myself to pause, breathe, and take a moment to appreciate the present moment. To be grateful for the lessons I had learned, for the growth I had experienced, and for the people who had supported me along the way. As I practiced gratitude, I began to notice something else. My relationships started to shift. I had always been focused on what I could do for others, on how I could make them proud, on how I could be the best version of myself for them. But now, I began to see that my relationships needed to be more about mutual respect, understanding, and love, rather than fulfilling expectations. I started to prioritize relationships where I could be myself, where I could show up authentically, and where I didn't have to constantly perform to be loved or accepted. The more I embraced my authenticity, the more I realized that I wasn't just changing my relationship with others, I was changing my relationship with myself. I had spent so many years trying to prove my worth, to earn love, to live up to someone else's version of success. But now, I began to see that I was worthy just as I was, without having to prove anything to anyone. I was enough, simply by being me. This realization was both liberating and humbling. It meant letting go of the need for perfection. It meant embracing my flaws, my mistakes, and my imperfections as part of my story. It meant forgiving myself for the times I had fallen short of my own expectations, and it meant accepting that I would continue to make mistakes. But these mistakes no longer defined me. They were simply opportunities to learn, to grow, and to become more aligned with who I truly was. As I reflected on my journey, I realized that living authentically was not a destination, it was a practice. It was a daily commitment to showing up for myself, to being true to who I was, to embracing the uncertainties of life without fear. It was about finding joy in the present moment, rather than waiting for some distant future where everything would be perfect. I also began to realize that authenticity isn't always easy. It's not always comfortable. It's not always popular. But it is always worth it. Living authentically means having the courage to be yourself, even when it's difficult, even when it means standing out or going against the grain. It means speaking your truth, even when it's hard to say. It means setting boundaries and saying no when something doesn't align with your values. It means choosing yourself, even when others might not understand. And through all of this, I learned to trust the process. I learned to trust that life, in all its ups and downs, was unfolding exactly as it was meant to. I learned to trust that every experience, every challenge, every moment of joy and pain was part of my journey. And most importantly, I learned to trust that no matter what happened, I would be okay. Because I had learned to trust myself. As I continued to embrace this new way of living, I began to feel a deep sense of fulfillment that I had never experienced before. It wasn't about achieving external success or meeting the expectations of others. It was about being true to myself, about living a life that was aligned with my values and my purpose. And that, I realized, was the greatest success of all. As I continued my journey of living authentically, I began to understand that life wasn't about striving for constant perfection or chasing an elusive idea of success. It wasn't about meeting other people's expectations or fitting into predefined molds. It was about embracing the fluidity of life and accepting that the only true measure of success is how in tune you are with your own values, desires, and purpose. The more I let go of the need to constantly achieve or prove myself, the more I began to appreciate the beauty of being in the present moment. For so long, I had been living in a state of perpetual striving, always looking for the next milestone, the next step, the next achievement. It was exhausting. I realized that I had been running a race without ever stopping to ask why I was running in the first place. What was I really trying to prove? And to whom? The truth was, I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I had already proven enough to myself. This realization wasn't an easy one. It was uncomfortable, to be honest. I had spent years building my identity around accomplishments, around meeting goals, and around satisfying the expectations of others. But as I began to loosen my grip on these external measures of success, I discovered something profound. My value was not tied to what I did, but to who I was. I didn't have to constantly chase after new achievements to feel worthy. I was enough as I was, in every imperfect, beautiful, messy moment of my life. Living authentically meant learning to be okay with the uncertainty. It meant accepting that I wouldn't always have everything figured out, and that was perfectly okay. It meant acknowledging that life is full of surprises, some welcome and some not, but they are all part of the process. I realized that when I let go of the need to control everything, when I released the expectations I had placed on myself and on life, I was able to embrace the unexpected with more grace and ease. This newfound sense of peace wasn't a fleeting moment of happiness, nor was it something that would disappear the moment life threw a curveball my way. It was a state of being, a deep, internal shift that allowed me to approach life's challenges with a calm, centered mind. It meant that when things didn't go as planned, I could accept it, learn from it, and move forward without judgment or regret. I began to realize that mistakes weren't failures, they were stepping stones to growth. They were necessary parts of the journey, just as important as the victories. I also began to see that the key to living authentically was finding balance. It wasn't about abandoning all ambition or letting go of dreams. It was about aligning those dreams with my authentic self and my deeper purpose. It was about pursuing goals that felt meaningful to me, not because I felt pressured to achieve them, but because they resonated with my values. I had been so focused on achieving success for the sake of success that I had forgotten to ask myself if the goals I was pursuing were truly aligned with what I wanted out of life. By reconnecting with my core values, I started to shift my focus from external validation to internal fulfillment. I found that when I stopped measuring success by the standards of others, I was able to make decisions that felt right for me. It wasn't about how much money I made, or how impressive my job title was, or how many accolades I received. It was about finding joy in the work I did, in the relationships I nurtured, and in the way I lived each day. It was about feeling at peace with who I was and where I was in life, regardless of where society or anyone else thought I should be. This shift in perspective had a profound impact on my mental and emotional well-being. I realized that much of my anxiety and stress had stemmed from my constant need to live up to someone else's expectations. I had been chasing a version of success that wasn't mine, and in doing so, I had neglected the things that truly mattered to me, my own happiness, my inner peace, and my sense of fulfillment. Letting go of the pressure to meet external standards allowed me to feel lighter, more at ease, and more connected to the present moment. However, living authentically also required me to confront some uncomfortable truths. I had to look at the ways I had been limiting myself, the beliefs I had been holding onto that no longer served me. I had to be honest about the fears and insecurities that had been guiding my decisions. Fear had played a huge role in my life: fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of not being good enough. But as I continued to grow, I realized that fear wasn't something I had to let control me. Fear was simply an emotion, a response to the unknown, but it didn't have to dictate my actions. I learned to acknowledge my fears, but not to let them hold me back. Every time I faced something that made me anxious or uncomfortable, I took it as an opportunity to grow. The more I leaned into fear, the more I realized that it was often an indicator that I was on the right path. Fear wasn't a sign that I should turn back, It was a sign that I was stepping out of my comfort zone, and that was where the real growth happened. Along the way, I also learned the importance of self-compassion. For so long, I had been my own harshest critic, always focusing on what I hadn't done, what I hadn't achieved, or what I had done wrong. But as I embraced living authentically, I realized that I had to be kinder to myself. I had to give myself the grace to make mistakes, to learn, to grow, and to change. Self-compassion wasn't about being complacent or letting myself off the hook for bad behavior. It was about acknowledging that I was human, that I was doing my best, and that I deserved love and respect, even when I wasn't perfect. This journey wasn't just about learning to accept myself, it was about learning to love myself. It was about realizing that I was worthy of happiness, love, and success, regardless of my past mistakes or the mistakes I would inevitably make in the future. It was about learning to treat myself with the same kindness, compassion, and understanding that I offered to others. As I continued to live authentically, I also began to notice the changes in the world around me. I had started to cultivate a deeper connection to the people in my life. I no longer felt the need to impress them or live up to their expectations. Instead, I showed up as my true self, and as I did, I found that the relationships that were truly meant for me began to flourish. I surrounded myself with people who accepted me as I was, who loved me for my authenticity, and who encouraged me to continue growing. These relationships were real, genuine, and supportive, and they provided me with the foundation of love and acceptance that I needed to keep moving forward. Through this process, I also became more open to new experiences. I had spent so much of my life staying within my comfort zone, doing what I knew, avoiding the unknown. But as I embraced the unknown, I realized that it held so much potential for growth, for learning, and for new opportunities. I stopped fearing change, and instead, I started to see it as a natural part of life, something to embrace, rather than resist. And with each new experience, each new step forward, I felt more connected to the person I was becoming. I wasn't just living for the future anymore. I was living for the now, for the joy of each moment, for the excitement of the unknown. Life wasn't something to be endured or escaped from, it was something to be embraced, in all its messy, beautiful, unpredictable glory. As I continued to embrace my authentic self, a realization started to sink in deeper. Life, in its purest form, wasn't about controlling every outcome. It was about learning how to flow with the natural rhythm of life. For so long, I had been determined to map out every part of my existence, to control what would happen and how I would react. But now, I began to see that life couldn't be fully lived in a spreadsheet or through rigid planning. It had to be experienced, moment by moment, with an open heart and mind. The more I practiced living authentically, the more I felt that my journey was less about achievement and more about alignment. In the past, I had viewed life as a checklist of accomplishments, career goals, personal milestones, financial stability, and so on. These were the things I believed would give me meaning and purpose. But the deeper I went into this process of self-discovery, the more I realized that the true meaning of life wasn't found in the list of things I could tick off. It was found in the moments I lived fully, in the relationships I nurtured, in the decisions I made that aligned with my values. Living authentically had shown me that my purpose wasn't something to be found somewhere out there in the future. It wasn't something I could chase after or acquire through external means. It was something I already had within me, something I could access at any moment, simply by being true to who I was. This shift in understanding was profound. I no longer felt the need to strive endlessly towards some far-off version of success that was dictated by others. Instead, I began to focus on the present moment, the present decision, the present action, the present connection. I started realizing that in every action I took, I was either moving closer to or further from my true self. That was the ultimate guide. It wasn't about the destination, it was about the journey, the choices I made along the way. With this new mindset, I began to pay closer attention to my surroundings. I stopped rushing through life, trying to get to the next big thing. I started savoring the small moments, the warmth of the sun on my face, the sound of my favorite song playing on the radio, the laughter shared with friends. These moments, which I had once overlooked in my pursuit of bigger and better things, became the moments that mattered most. Life was happening all around me, right here, right now, and I didn't want to miss it. I also began to look inward, examining the beliefs and patterns that had shaped my life up until that point. There were still remnants of old beliefs that I had to confront, old fears, old insecurities, and old narratives that no longer served me. Some of these were deeply ingrained, and facing them wasn't easy. But the more I embraced this path of authenticity, the more I understood that true freedom came from letting go of these limiting beliefs. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about releasing the need to be someone I wasn't and accepting who I truly was. One of the biggest lessons I learned during this time was that it was okay to not have all the answers. I had spent so much of my life thinking I had to figure everything out, that I had to know exactly what the next step would be, that I had to have a plan for every eventuality. But now, I understood that it was okay to live in the uncertainty, to sit with the discomfort of not knowing what the future held. In fact, it was in that space of uncertainty that true growth happened. The unknown wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace. With each new day, I allowed myself to be more present, more in tune with what my heart was telling me, more willing to take risks and follow my instincts. It wasn't always easy. There were times when doubt crept in, times when I wondered if I was on the right path, times when I missed the safety of knowing exactly what was coming next. But as I learned to trust myself more, to trust my decisions, I realized that the only way forward was through. There was no other choice but to keep walking, one step at a time. During this process, I also began to embrace the power of vulnerability. For so much of my life, I had built walls around myself, afraid to show anyone my true self, afraid to let others see my flaws and imperfections. But as I let go of the need to be perfect, I began to see that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. It was through being vulnerable that I was able to connect more deeply with others, to share my truth, and to receive the support and love that I had always needed but was too afraid to ask for. Vulnerability became a gateway to deeper relationships. Relationships where I could be truly seen and heard, where I could be accepted for who I was, rather than who I thought I needed to be. I realized that I didn't have to put on a facade to be loved or valued. The people who truly mattered to me loved me for my authenticity, not for a version of me that I had tried to create to meet expectations. As I continued to embrace my true self, I also learned to let go of comparison. For so long, I had been comparing myself to others, measuring my worth against their accomplishments, their successes, and their perceived happiness. But as I began to live more authentically, I realized that comparison was a trap. It was a distraction that kept me from focusing on my own path, my own growth, and my own happiness. Instead of comparing myself to others, I started focusing on my own journey, celebrating my progress, no matter how small it seemed. I also realized that part of living authentically was being willing to say no. I had spent so much of my life trying to please others, agreeing to things that didn't align with my values or my goals, simply because I didn't want to disappoint anyone. But as I embraced my authenticity, I realized that saying no wasn't a rejection of others, it was an act of self-respect. By saying no to things that didn't align with my truth, I was saying yes to myself, to my own needs, and to my own happiness. This process of self-acceptance and self-respect was a continuous one. Every day, I had to make a conscious choice to honor myself, to honor my values, and to live my truth. There were still moments when I felt tempted to fall back into old patterns, when I felt the pull of old beliefs or societal pressures. But I had come so far that I wasn't willing to give up the progress I had made. I had learned that the path to authenticity wasn't a straight line, it was full of twists and turns, of setbacks and breakthroughs. But with each step, I was moving closer to the person I was meant to be. And with that, I realized something even more important. The journey of living authentically wasn't just about me. It was about inspiring others to do the same. It was about creating a ripple effect, where others could see the power of living truthfully and be inspired to break free from the chains of expectation and conformity. It was about creating a world where authenticity wasn't something to be feared, but something to be celebrated. As I continued to walk this path, I knew that the journey would never be over. There would always be new lessons to learn, new ways to grow, and new challenges to face. But I also knew that I was exactly where I needed to be. And for the first time in my life, I was content with that. I was content with who I was, content with where I was going, and most importantly, content with the person I was becoming. As I reached the final chapter of this part of my journey, I realized that living authentically wasn't a destination but a continuous process. I had spent so many years chasing after a version of success that was dictated by others, by society, by my family, by my fears, and now, I was beginning to understand that the true success lay not in achieving some external goal, but in the ability to show up fully in my own life. I had learned that the most important thing I could do was to stay true to myself. Every day, I faced the challenge of making choices that aligned with my values, my desires, and my purpose. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments when I questioned my path, but those moments had become less frequent. The more I trusted myself, the less I relied on the approval of others. I had come to understand that my worth wasn't tied to the things I accomplished or the approval I received. It was inherent in who I was. But even as I embraced this new understanding of myself, there was one final piece of the puzzle that I had to confront: the idea of letting go. Letting go of old stories. Letting go of past hurts. Letting go of the need to be perfect, to have everything figured out. For so long, I had held on to the narrative of who I thought I was supposed to be. I had held on to the idea that my life had to follow a certain script, that I had to live according to someone else's plan. But in this final phase of my transformation, I realized that letting go of those expectations was the key to embracing the fullness of my authentic self. Letting go didn't mean giving up. It didn't mean abandoning my goals, my dreams, or my aspirations. It meant releasing the pressure to live up to a version of myself that I thought I should be. It meant giving myself permission to be imperfect, to make mistakes, and to be okay with it. It meant allowing myself to be human and to embrace all that came with it. The successes, the failures, the joys, the struggles. Letting go also meant releasing the need for external validation. I had spent so much of my life seeking approval from others, whether it was from my parents, my peers, or society at large. I had believed that my worth was tied to how others saw me, how much I achieved, and how well I met their expectations. But as I let go of this need for validation, I began to realize that my worth was intrinsic. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I was enough, just as I was. And in this process of letting go, I also began to embrace the power of forgiveness. Forgiveness wasn't just about letting others off the hook, it was about freeing myself. It was about releasing the anger, the resentment, and the hurt that had been holding me captive for so long. Forgiveness was a gift I gave to myself, a way to let go of the emotional baggage that had weighed me down for years. As I forgave myself for my past mistakes and let go of the need to be perfect, I also began to forgive those who had hurt me. I realized that holding on to grudges only kept me stuck in the past. It prevented me from fully embracing the present moment and moving forward with an open heart. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing someone else's behavior, it was about freeing myself from the chains of bitterness and resentment. Through this process of letting go, I also learned to trust the timing of my life. For so long, I had been in a hurry. I wanted everything now. I wanted to achieve my goals immediately, to have all the answers, to know exactly where my life was heading. But as I slowed down, I began to realize that life unfolds in its own time. Sometimes, the most important thing I could do was wait and trust that things would fall into place when the time was right. This trust in the timing of life was a powerful lesson. It allowed me to let go of the need for control and to embrace the ebb and flow of life's rhythms. I no longer felt the need to rush or to force things to happen. I understood that every experience, every challenge, and every setback was part of the journey. And it was all happening in its own perfect time. In this final stage of my journey, I also began to reflect on the importance of living with intention. I had spent so much time in the past reacting to life, letting external circumstances dictate my mood and my decisions. But now, I understood that true power comes from living intentionally, from making conscious choices that reflect who I am and what I value. Living with intention meant being present, being aware, and making decisions that were in alignment with my true self. This new way of living required me to be mindful of how I spent my time, where I placed my energy, and who I surrounded myself with. I had learned that my environment, both internal and external, played a significant role in my well-being. I had to be intentional about the people I let into my life, the activities I engaged in, and the thoughts I allowed to take root in my mind. Every day was an opportunity to choose the life I wanted to create, to step into my power and live with purpose. And as I continued to live with intention, I began to feel a deeper sense of fulfillment. I no longer felt like I was running from one thing to the next, constantly seeking approval or validation. Instead, I was living in harmony with myself, embracing the flow of life, and trusting that everything was unfolding as it should. I realized that fulfillment wasn't about reaching a specific destination or achieving a certain goal. It was about living fully in each moment, embracing the ups and downs, and finding joy in the process of living. As I looked back on everything I had learned, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. I was grateful for the challenges, for the setbacks, for the moments of doubt, because they had all been part of the journey. They had shaped me into the person I was today, a person who was no longer afraid to live authentically, to trust myself, and to embrace the unknown. In the end, I realized that the true purpose of life wasn't to reach some final destination, but to live fully in each moment, to be true to myself, and to embrace the journey. Every step along the way was an opportunity for growth, for learning, and for becoming more aligned with who I was meant to be. And so, as I continued on this path, I knew that there would always be new challenges, new lessons, and new opportunities. But I also knew that I was exactly where I needed to be. I had found peace within myself, and that peace was enough. It was all I needed to live the life I had always dreamed of, the life I was meant to live.